Welcome to Masters and Creators from Frames to Names, the show where we look at some of the most influential creators in history and how their influence impacts the way we tell stories to this day. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at one of the masters of Marvel, Steve Ditko. So quickly before we get into this episode, at the end of the last episode I did say that this episode would be on Danganronpa, but as I wrote that video I kind of decided the best way to experience Danganronpa is to play it. Making a video on it really didn't make much sense, so I just decided that it would be best if we moved on to the episode on Steve Ditko rather than doing a Danganronpa special. Although one day I might do something on Danganronpa, I don't feel it will be in this series, it might be on my YouTube channel. Spider-Man, Hawk and Dove, Doctor Strange. Do any of these sound familiar to you? Well, they should, because they were all created by Steve Ditko, one of the masters of Marvel Comics. This man is right up there when it comes to influential comic creators. Like, it is Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Stan Lee. Like, without this guy, comics would not be what they are today. He is comic book history. So I'm going to say this right from the beginning, we know very little about Steve Ditko's personal life. He has come out and said that he is an artist and a writer, and as a result he has not done any interviews since the 1960s. He wants to sell his work and not his personality, and I feel that's very admirable. So Ditko was born in 1927 in Pennsylvania, and his father was massively into newspaper comic strips. So when Batman was released, Steve's own interest in comic books just exploded. In 1945 he enlisted in the military and he would draw comics for the military newspaper. So when he was discharged, he decided he wanted to go down this path. He found out that Jerry Robinson, the artist behind Batman, was actually teaching classes at the school that would become the School of Visual Art in New York. He would enroll at the school, and it's here that Stan Lee, the editor of Atlas Comics, would actually see Ditko's work for the first time. His first professional published work was the story Paper Romance, which was released in Daring Love in 1953. And after this, he started working at Joe Simon and Jack Kirby Studio as a background artist. By 1960, he had co-created Captain Atom with Joe Gill. Captain Atom was originally a Charlton Comics character, but years later the character would be bought by DC. But the ultimate interpretation of this character, in my opinion, is when Alan Moore adapted this character for his story The Watchmen and created Dr. Manhattan. By 1955 he was working with Atlas Comics a lot more. He would work on Strange Tales, Strange Worlds, Tales to Astonish, and Amazing Adventures. These books would typically have several stories in them, and Ditko would usually do the closing story, and it would be like these really surrealist shorts that were oftentimes co-written by Stan Lee. Ditko's stories were so popular that Amazing Adventures was actually reformatted and renamed to Amazing Adult Fantasy. Years later, Stan Lee would actually admit that oftentimes he would just give Ditko a one-line synopsis of what the plot would be, and Ditko would do the rest of the work. Eventually, Stan Lee would go to Jack Kirby and would be like, I've got this idea for a character. He's a teen hero, he finds a magic ring, he gets spider powers, he's called Spider-Man or the Silver Spider. Can you do something with that idea? And Jack Kirby would draw up about 6 pages, and these pages would be far too heroic for the hero Stan Lee had in mind. He would then go to Ditko with the same thing, but would actually give him Kirby's pages as reference. Ditko basically completely ignored Stan Lee's concept, but ran with the name Spider-Man. So he didn't want the character to wear boots or massive gloves, so he gave him wall-clinging powers and just put like this bodysuit on him. He also didn't think it made much sense for a character that was a hero to be running around with a boyish face, so he created the mask to cover the character's face. Also, Jack Kirby's Spider-Man shot a gun, and that's how he web-slung, whereas Steve Ditko decided, you know what, let's just have this come out from his wrists. Years later, Ditko would say something along the lines of, Stan Lee made the name Spider-Man, Ditko did everything else. Quick side note though, I don't want this video to come across as me crapping on Stan Lee. I do have a lot of respect for him, and in recent years he has stated that he's made a lot of mistakes through his career, and not giving people credit where credit is due is one of them. So I don't think you need to crap on him, because he understands in those early days he did make a lot of mistakes. So Spider-Man would debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962, and everyone loved this character. But this was actually the last ever issue of Amazing Fantasy. So the character was given his own series, The Amazing Spider-Man. And Ditko was doing a lot of the work on the plot of these books, to the point that he actually had to complain to Stan Lee and say, hey, I want credit for plotting, I'm not getting credit for this. And Stan Lee would be like, okay, I guess you're right. But this only happened as of issue number 25. The book had already been running for 3 years at that point. In 1963, Strange Tales would see the introduction of Doctor Strange. I consider Doctor Strange Steve Ditko's masterwork. As much as Spider-Man is considerably more popular than Doctor Strange, I think Doctor Strange just says a lot more. His run on Strange Tales is surreal and psychedelic, and it sees the introduction of eternity as a living concept. Unfortunately, it wasn't long after Ditko left the book that the book would be renamed Doctor Strange. He wasn't around to see the golden age of this character. And I will say, in recent years, the character has been very much watered down. I would even say Ditko's run on Doctor Strange influenced the most recent run on Scarlet Witch, and has even influenced characters like Doctor Doom. Ditko would eventually leave Marvel, and no one really knows why. A lot of people have come out of the woodworks and said that Ditko and Stan Lee agreed on like nothing. Not just like on comic creation, but also on like politics and general life and people's rights, and there's a whole thing. But Lee has also come out and said that the two of them never really knew each other personally, they weren't ever friends or buddy-buddies, so who knows? Still in 1966, Ditko would leave Marvel, and by 1968 he was working for DC. He would create The Creeper and Hawk and Dove, and all of his stories were very different from what DC were doing at that time. It was pulpy, but it was pulp with something to say. It wasn't just stories for the sake of stories. By 1969, he was back at Charlton Comics, would stay there till 1975, in which time he would return to DC and create Shade the Changing Man. This was like a really popular series. It could have been argued that it was sort of like DC's version of Doctor Strange, more in tonality rather than story. The stories are very different. And like I said, the series was incredibly popular, but by 1978 it was cancelled as a part of the DC implosion, where they cancelled just 1/3 of their titles unceremoniously and without explanation. From the 70s through to the 90s, he'd do a bit of work here and there and create various characters, but I think his most notable character was actually created in 1992, at which point he would create one of my favourite characters of all time, Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl is a satirical character that has the power of squirrels. She has a squirrel army, and she has defeated villains such as Thanos, Galactus, and Doctor Doom. So many people hate on this character completely, say that she's overpowered for her power set, and it doesn't make sense to have a character for the sake of comedy, but then those same people like Deadpool, so I'm just like, no, you just have a problem with her because squirrels. Unfortunately, Squirrel Girl was one of the last original characters he would create, and in 1998, he retired from mainstream comics completely. Since then, most of his work that's been released is reprints or stories that have been found from the 70s and 80s, and it's like, really telling about how little this man is credited, in that I could go down the street and ask a person who Stan Lee is, and they would know who Stan Lee is, but if I asked who Steve Ditko is, they probably wouldn't know. Without Spider-Man being made by Steve Ditko, everything from comic books to comic book movies would be incredibly different. Like, as much as the Spider-Man movies have been very hit and miss, they've been very influential, especially those early ones on the comic book movie field. And even without Doctor Strange, we wouldn't have had some of my favourite comic books. I mean, one of my favourite series of all time is The Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison, and that's very trippy and very psychedelic, and definitely builds upon the foundation that Steve Ditko laid in Doctor Strange. If you're still not convinced about how influential this guy is, this guy, Jack Kirby, and Stan Lee all created a foundation at Marvel. It was a collaborative effort. The Marvel Cinematic Universe builds upon and uses this foundation, and that's why every other company that's attempting a fictional universe are not pulling it off, because they do not have that Marvel Cinematic Universe foundation. If you want to read Ditko for yourself, I definitely recommend you check out Spider-Man or Strange Tales with his run on Doctor Strange, or anything he's done is amazing, but I definitely recommend those two in particular because those two are his most influential work and his masterwork. But for now, that's all we got time for today. Make sure to tune in next week to Masters and Creators from Frames to Names.